Okay, we're getting started with Chapter 6, Choosing a Reasonable Scale. A scale is a set of numbers used to help label the graph. So as you look at a graph, the scale will be the numbers that go up the side um, vertically, up and down. And then many times there'll be numbers, also a scale that will go side to side horizontally. We call those X and Y axes, and we'll get into those in the next lesson, naming those specifically. But those numbers on the side are called the scale, and then the numbers that you end up counting by end up being what's called your interval. All right, I'm going to show you those in our next two slides. All right, so making these a graph of these data, what would be a good interval to use for the scale? So these are our numbers. This is our data, or these are our data. 12, 46, 39, 88, 15, 76, 18, 22, 29, 37, 65. So just going to graph them, or set up a scale for them, sorry, a couple different ways. So if we're going to have a scale that came up here on the side, have to make sure that we can graph all of these data. So I'm going to exaggerate a little bit here. But if I said I'm going to count by 2, so this is my scale. My interval here is 2. I would end up with 20. You can see that this interval, this scale, the interval that I use is not acceptable because 12 I would be able to graph on there, right here. 46, 39, 88, 76, even 22, 29, 37, 65. All of these are too small. So we would end up having, if we were making a bar graph, our bar graph would go way up off of the graph paper because we would have to go all the way up into the 80s or the 70s here, the 60s. And our graph paper with the interval that we chose too, it goes up to 20, and I have way more data than I need to graph. All right. For this one, I'll exaggerate on the other end. I'll say go 50, 100, 150, 200, 250, 300, 350, 400, 450, and so I'd end up with 500 up here. This one, all of my data would end up being right in here. All of my bars, if I was making a bar graph, all of my dots, if I was making a line graph, would all end up being here, and all of this would be wasted. There would be no space. All this space up here would be wasted. There would be no bars in here. There would be no dots in here. All of this would end up being wasted. And so that's no good either. So choosing the appropriate interval is very important. So again, this is called a scale right here. This is also called a scale. My interval here was 2. I counted by 2s, 2, 4, 6, 8. My interval here was 50. 50, 100, 150, 200, 250, 300, 350, 400, 450, 500. So my interval here is 50. And neither one of those were appropriate for what we were trying to accomplish here. All right, so let's start thinking about what a good interval would be. All right, let's try something in between 2 and 50. All right, and maybe 5 would be a good interval. Let's try that. 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50. And I would not be able to graph 65, 76, 88. So I'm missing out on a few. I need to get all the way up to 88 so I can graph that. So maybe I would choose something a little bit larger, like 10. 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. So I can graph all the way up to 100. My my largest piece of data is 88, so that would be right in this area. So again, I'd be losing out on a little bit of space. So maybe I can try a different number, maybe 9. 9, 18, 27, 36, 45, 54, 63, 72, 81, 90. And that would be a good interval here. It would end up that I could graph 88. I would use up the whole space. If I had bars, my tallest bar would be right up close to the top line there. And so there would be very little wasted space. So I think that that might be the one I would choose if I was going to do this. 9, 18, 27, 36, 45, 54, 63, 72, 81. You can see I just went every other one here. As I was trying to fill in this interval, it got very crowded. And so you'll see this sometimes on graphs where they'll tell you that this is, 0 is always down here at the bottom. 0, then 9, then 18, then 27. So you can figure out what the interval is by what they have, but they won't always put every single one if it ends up being too crowded. All right. Okay, well, let's try another one here. For making a graph of these data, what would be a good interval to use for the scale? We have from 112 here, looks like the smallest piece of data. It has to go all the way up. I've got some 400, 700, 500. So my largest piece of data here is 768. So I need to get all the way up to 768. So if I was to start down here at 0, let's try counting by 50. 50, 100, 150, 200, 250, 300, 350, 400, 450, 500. A lot of my information can be graphed there, but I could not graph this 768. So counting by 50s doesn't quite get me where I need to go. So if I counted by 100, 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, 600, 700, 800. So all of my data would be graphed below here. And I would be missing out on some of this space right here. So I could count by something just a little bit less. Maybe 80. Try that. 80, 160, 240, 320, 400, 480, 560, 640, 720, and 800. Now again, 800 would get that filled up. My 768 would come up near that 800 line. And so that seems like it would be a good good interval to use for my scale. So it would fill up all of the graph paper that I had and make the bars the full length of the graph paper. If I was using a line graph and I was making dots, the dots would fill up all the way through here and there would be very little wasted space up at the top. All right, so I will go ahead and put these in. I have a little bit more space here, so I might try and just go ahead and put every line labeled. That's 80, 160, 240, 320, 400, 480. All right, so this is how I would label my scale. This is the interval I would use if I was going to graph this data. One mistake I didn't talk about yet, but one mistake many kids will make is they'll label these lines um, for the pieces of data. They'll put 112 on this line, and then 288 on this line, or sorry, 227 on this line, and then 288 on this line, and so on. But you make your scale and your interval to fit this data right here. You do not take this data and fit it onto the scale. You make your scale so that you're able to graph this data right here. That's what you're making your scale for. All right, so you will always choose your scale. You can see each one of these lines is the same space away. So you want all of these things to be the same space away. So that's why you choose your interval. Each of these has 80 in between it, all the way up. Okay. All right, so I hope that helps as you are choosing the appropriate scale for your data.